Today in the Daily Dose, Daily Dose Biographies presents The Founding Fathers. Samuel Adams. As a student at Harvard, Samuel Adams was introduced to the writings of Enlightenment philosopher John Locke. In particular, Locke's argument that every man is born with certain inalienable rights that can't be taken away, and that governments exist by the consent of the people, leading Adams to write his 1743 master's thesis on the legality of resisting British rule. Upon his father's death in 1748, Adams proved to be a lackluster businessman when he bankrupted the family brewing business, followed by an equally botched job as a Boston tax collector, where his inept accounting came up thousands of pounds short. What Adams did excel at was writing, and as tensions began to rise between colonists and their British overlords, Adams became a leading voice in the push for American independence. By the mid-1760s, after the British imposed taxes on the colonies with the intent of paying down debts accrued during the 7 Years' War, Adams wrote a string of newspaper articles under the pen names Vindex and Candidus, denouncing British taxation without representation in Parliament, at the same time joining an underground group of activists known as the Loyal Nine, which would later morph into the Sons of Liberty. When British Parliament yet again burdened the colonies with the Tea Act of 1773, Adams encouraged his fellow Bostonians to impede tea shipments by the British East India Company, leading Adams to write after the Boston Tea Party that the protesters have acted upon pure and upright principle. By 1775, British authorities had grown weary of Adams and his activism, and when the British sent a force of soldiers to arrest Adams and fellow activist John Hancock in Lexington, Massachusetts, the ensuing battles of Lexington and Concord proved to be the ignition point in the Revolutionary War. A vocal delegate in the Continental Congress, Adams signed the Declaration of Independence and later helped pen the Articles of Confederation. After stepping down from the Continental Congress in 1781, Adams spent his later years in Massachusetts politics, serving as president of the state senate and later lieutenant governor under Governor John Hancock, passing away at age 81 on October 2, 1803, making Samuel Adams one of the clearest voices in America's push for independence. Franklin came up with a list of 13 main virtues to which he felt that everyone should strive to live by. Once established, Franklin dedicated himself to building up these virtues in himself, developing self-editing charts to record his daily progress, ensuring that his results were always one of upward improvement. Once he had mastered a given virtue, he then moved on to focus on the next in line in his ongoing push for self-excellence. Franklin's first virtue was temperance, where he proclaimed, "Eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation." Although in his later years, Franklin became quite a prodigious consumer of alcohol. His second virtue was silence, where he advised, "Speak not but what may benefit others or yourself, and avoid trifling conversations." Third was order, so that all a person's belongings had their rightful place, and each part of one's business had its time. Fourth was resolution, where he encouraged people to perform without fail whatever that person resolved to do. Fifth was frugality, which suggested that a person should make no expense but to do good to others, while sixth was industry, where people should lose no time and always be employed in something useful. 7 was sincerity without hurtful deceit. "Think innocently and justly," he wrote, "and if you speak, speak accordingly." 8 was justice, where he encouraged his colonial brethren to wrong no other man, while 9 was moderation in all things, and 10 was cleanliness, both in body, clothing, and home. Tranquility made up his number 11, where he encouraged readers to be not disturbed by trifles or by accidents common or unavoidable. Chastity made up his number 12, where he wrote to rarely use sex but for health or offspring, while Franklin's last virtue was humility, where he encouraged people to imitate Jesus and Socrates. George Washington. Born in 1732 Virginia, George Washington was homeschooled by tutors on the family plantation until his father passed away when George was only 11. The family's loss forced Washington to assist in the management of the plantation until his adept math skills landed him a job as a surveyor in his teen years, which earned him enough money to buy land of his own. When his half-brother and mentor Lawrence Washington passed away in 1752, George inherited Lawrence's Mount Vernon estate along the Potomac River, which would become his home for the remainder of his life. That same year, despite a complete lack of military experience, Washington was made commander-in-chief of the Virginia militia due to his uncanny leadership skills during the French and Indian War, which saw 2 horses shot out from under him before returning to Mount Vernon with 4 near-miss bullet holes in his overcoat. After resigning his commission to grow Mount Vernon from 2,000 acres into an 8,000-acre mega-complex of 5 working farms, in 1759, Washington married wealthy widow Martha Dandridge Custis before his election to the Virginia House of Burgesses that same year. His growing skills as a statesman made him a delegate to the First and Second Continental Congress, and after war broke out between the young Republic and Great Britain, Washington was named Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, where he inspired patriot forces despite overwhelming odds against the largest superpower of the day. After 8 grueling years of war, Washington's performance at the Battle of Yorktown, the last major engagement of the Revolutionary War, made him a national hero to a war-weary yet victorious young nation. Combined with his impressive leadership skills during the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Washington was elected the first American president in 1789, serving 2 terms that saw the ratification of 5 new states into the Union. During his lifetime, George Washington suffered a dizzying array of illnesses, including smallpox, repeated bouts of malaria, tuberculosis, dysentery, and multiple infections and abscesses with recurrent high fevers. In December of 1799, Washington caught a cold while inspecting his properties in the rain, which soon worsened into a throat infection that took his life on December 14, 1799. At the time of his death, Washington owned over 300 slaves, yet due to his growing opposition to slavery in his later years, by order of his last will and testament, his slaves were freed after his wife's death in 1802, making George Washington one of the most recognized men in American history. Patrick Henry. Born in 1736, Hanover County, Virginia, as a young man, Patrick Henry taught himself law while working as a tavern keep at his father-in-law's inn, opening a law practice in 1760 that soon flourished due to his adept skills as a legal scholar and orator. Henry's first major case was known as the Parsons Cause of 1763, which has since been viewed by historians as an important precursor to the American Revolution. In the case, ministers of the Church of England had historically received their annual salaries in pounds of tobacco. However, when a severe drought in the late 1750s inflated tobacco prices to 6 pennies a pound, the Virginia legislature passed the 2-Penny Act, which reduced ministers' income to 2 pennies a pound. When Britain's King George III overturned the law upon clergy appeal, Henry's impassioned speech against British overreach elevated the young attorney's importance within the independence movement. After Great Britain passed the Stamp Act in 1765, intended to help pay down the growing cost of defending the American colonies, Patrick Henry responded with a series of resolutions introduced in the Virginia legislature, which helped articulate America's stance against taxation without representation. In a series of speeches, Henry argued that Virginians should pay no taxes except those voted upon by Virginians themselves, at the same time flirting with treason when he hinted that King George might well suffer the same fate as Julius Caesar should he maintain his oppressive policies over the colonies. In a 1775 speech before the Second Virginia Convention, held to discuss strategies against the British, Patrick Henry delivered his now famous speech, which ended in "Give me liberty or give me death." The speech was heard by George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and 5 of the 6 other Virginians who would later sign the Declaration of Independence, which in turn convinced the Virginia legislature to prepare troops for war against Great Britain. During and following the Revolutionary War, Henry would serve as Virginia's 1st and 6th governor, becoming an outspoken anti-federalist, opposed to the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, as well as limiting the power of the federal government, which he feared could evolve into the same kind of monarchy he and his patriot brethren had fought against in the first place. His authorship of several anti-federalist papers would become instrumental in shaping the Bill of Rights, which comprised the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, further clarifying individual liberties while placing additional limits on the powers of the federal government. He passed away on June 6, 1799 from stomach cancer, ending the life of one of America's most influential founding fathers. John Hancock. Born in 1737, Massachusetts, after John Hancock's clergyman father passed away when Hancock was a boy, he was raised by his wealthy aunt and uncle in Boston, graduating Harvard College in 1754, before working for a decade in his uncle's shipping business. Upon his uncle's death in 1764, Hancock inherited a vast fortune and a thriving business, soon making him one of the richest men in the New England colonies. Entering local Boston politics as a selectman, after British Parliament imposed a steady stream of taxes on the colonies through what became known as the Intolerable Acts, in part to help pay for the colony's defense during the French and Indian War, anti-British sentiment reached a high point with such insurrectionist protest acts like the Boston Tea Party, which in turn helped to give the region its nickname, the Cradle of Liberty. Coming into direct conflict with the British, when officials seized one of his merchant ships in 1768, under claims of tax avoidance by illegally offloading cargo, Hancock became increasingly involved in a nation's push for independence, soon declaring Massachusetts an autonomous government when he was elected president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. Chosen as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, Hancock's revolutionary activities made him a leading target for British authorities, narrowly avoiding arrest in Lexington, Massachusetts, after Paul Revere's midnight ride and the ensuing first shots of the Revolutionary War at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Elected president of the Continental Congress in May of 1775, a body that would govern the new nation during the entirety of the war. According to legend, Hancock signed the Declaration of Independence in large bold letters so that King George III could see his name without the need for glasses. After resigning as head of the Continental Congress in 1777, Hancock went on to become an instrumental framer of the U.S. Constitution, while serving on and off as governor of Massachusetts until his death on October 8, 1793, making the life and politics of John Hancock a leading voice during and after the American Revolution. Benedict Arnold. Born in 1741 Norwich, Connecticut, when the Revolutionary War broke out, Benedict Arnold joined forces with Vermont frontiersman Ethan Allen, capturing the British garrison at Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York on May 10, 1775, followed a year later by an ill-fated trek from Maine to Quebec with the objective of rallying Canadians to the Patriot cause. With enlistments for many of his men set to expire on New Year's Day, Arnold launched an assault on British forces during the Battle of Quebec, which ended in the first major defeat for the Americans, not to mention a grave injury to one of Arnold's legs. Back on his feet by late 1776, Arnold predicted that the British fleet would sail a strike force down Lake Champlain, and after he supervised the construction of American warships, on October 11th of that same year, he surprised British General Guy Carleton's fleet at Valker Bay, and although he failed to defeat Carleton's armada, the delay forced the British to retreat to their winter quarters in Canada. Despite his contributions to the Patriot cause, Arnold felt resentment when 5 junior officers were promoted above him, resigning his commission in 1777, despite urgent appeals by General George Washington to reconsider his decision. He returned to service in the fall of 1777, where Arnold broke through the British line at the Battle of Bemis Heights in defiance of orders handed down from General Horatio Gates, a disobedience that contributed greatly to an American victory. British General John Burgoyne would surrender his forces at Saratoga 10 days later, which in turn convinced France to enter the war on the side of the Americans. Suffering a second serious injury to the same leg during the Battle of Bemis Heights, Arnold accepted a post as military governor of Philadelphia in 1778, where his continued resentment over what he saw as ungrateful indifference to his contributions slowly shifted his loyalties toward Britain. In 1779, after his appointment as commander of the American fort at West Point, papers were found on captured British Major John Andre, detailing an agreement by Arnold to surrender the fort to British forces in return for money and a command in the British Army. While Arnold fled successfully to the British side, John Andre was hanged as a spy in October of 1780. Arnold would become the most reviled name in America after his treason, prompting Ben Franklin to write that Judas sold only one man, while Arnold sold 3 millions. After America's victory against the British, Arnold lived in England despite British ambivalence to his presence, passing away from gout and other ailments on June 14, 1801, making Benedict Arnold one of the most infamous traitors in American history. Thomas Jefferson. After graduating from the College of William and Mary in 1762, Thomas Jefferson studied law under Virginia attorney George Wythe before opening his own practice in 1767. Well respected from an early age, from 1769 to 1775, Jefferson became a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, later renamed the Virginia House of Delegates after independence from Great Britain. Inheriting land near Charlottesville, Virginia, Jefferson's keen interest in architecture and gardening led to the construction of his beloved Monticello, or Little Mountain in the Italian, where he and his young wife Martha gave birth to 6 children before Martha's untimely death at the tender age of 33. While only 2 of their children would survive into adulthood, Jefferson was so devastated by the loss of his beloved wife that he would never marry again. As war broke out with Great Britain, in 1775, Jefferson was selected as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, where he penned the first draft of the Declaration of Independence at 33 years of age, resigning the following year when he was re-elected to the Virginia House of Delegates. From 1779 to 1781, Jefferson served as governor of Virginia before landing his second stint in Congress from 1783 to 1784. A year later, Jefferson succeeded Benjamin Franklin as U.S. Minister to France, and upon his return to the States in 1789, President George Washington appointed him as the nation's first Secretary of State, where he frequently bucked heads with Secretary of the Treasury and staunch big government Federalist Alexander Hamilton over foreign affairs, interpretations of the Constitution, and the size and authority of the federal government. Hamilton's insistence on a strong federal government would lead Jefferson to co-found the Democratic-Republican Party, which was an ideological precursor of today's Republican Party. In the presidential election of 1796, Jefferson defeated John Adams for the office of vice president, later running a second time against Adams for president during the election of 1800, which proved to be a bitter fight between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, just a few short years after both political sides had been so united in their revolutionary calls for independence. The crowning achievement of Jefferson's first term was his successful orchestration of the Louisiana Purchase from France, followed by Lewis and Clark's expedition into the newly purchased lands, an 8,000-mile journey which took them to the Pacific Ocean and back. Handily re-elected in 1804, Jefferson's second-term focus was to steer the United States safely away from involvement in the Napoleonic Wars of 1803 to 1815, which at one point or another dragged much of Europe into the conflict. After turning down a third term as president, Jefferson returned home to his beloved Monticello, where he continued to pursue his interest in architecture, music, reading, and gardening, at the same time helping to found the University of Virginia, which opened its doors for its first student body in 1825. After his death on July 4, 1826, 50 years to the day after he signed the Declaration of Independence, his surviving estate was heavily mired in debt due to a lifetime of extravagant spending, which in turn required that his slaves be sold at auction alongside his land holdings, art, and furnishings, forever cementing Thomas Jefferson into the early history of a newly formed nation. Alexander Hamilton. Born in the Caribbean in 1755, by age 11, Alexander Hamilton was hired as a clerk in a trading company on St. Croix, and after he wrote an eloquent letter describing a 1772 hurricane that struck the island, locals raised money to send him to King's College in New York, where he quickly involved himself in the push for American independence. When war broke out in 1775, Hamilton led an artillery company in the Continental Army, where he soon caught the attention of Commander-in-Chief General George Washington, after Hamilton's bravery and strategic forethought led to victories during the battles of Trenton and Princeton. Knowing that he could elevate his lowly birthright through valor on the battlefield, Hamilton accepted Washington's offer as his aide-de-camp until Washington granted Hamilton a field command under the Marquis de Lafayette during the siege of Yorktown, which led to the surrender of British General Lord Cornwallis and the eventual end of the Revolutionary War. After the war, Hamilton passed the New York bar exam before setting up a law practice in New York City. In 1787, he was chosen as a delegate to a federal convention in Philadelphia designed to overhaul the Articles of Confederation. And while Hamilton had little influence on drafting the Constitution itself, his participation in penning a series of pro-federal government essays alongside James Madison and John Jay, known today as the Federalist Papers, became his most remembered work. When Washington was unanimously elected as the first U.S. president in 1789, Hamilton was tapped as the first Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, where he pushed for the need for a national banking system and the federal absorption of state debts. Hamilton's call for a strong federal government drew ever-increasing pushback from statesmen like Madison and Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, leading to the nation's first political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, dividing the Founding Fathers a scant 15 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Hamilton's own hopes for ascending to the nation's highest office ended when he became involved in the country's first major sex scandal, when in 1797 he was forced to publish his infamous Reynolds pamphlet, where he confessed to an affair with the wife of James Reynolds, in order to clear his name from more serious charges of illegal financial speculation with James. The scandal would cost Hamilton and his wife Eliza the loss of their 21-year-old son Philip in 1801, when he was killed in a duel defending his father's honor. Hamilton himself was involved in no less than 10 affairs of honor due to his combative personality, the last one ending his life on July 12, 1804, following a duel with sitting Vice President Aaron Burr the previous day, making the life of Alexander Hamilton an important ignition point in America's long tradition of political dissension. Aaron Burr. Born in 1757 Newark, New Jersey, Aaron Burr enrolled in the College of New Jersey at Princeton at just 13 years of age, before graduating summa cum laude 3 years later. His subsequent law studies at Litchfield Law School in Connecticut were tabled upon the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, where he joined Benedict Arnold's men on their expedition to Quebec, earning the rank of major before serving under George Washington at his home in New York. Returning to his law studies after the war, Burr passed the bar exam, where his prosperous New York City practice landed him an appointment as Attorney General of New York. Winning a U.S. Senate seat in 1791, 9 years later, Burr ran for president with Thomas Jefferson, becoming Vice President of the United States when an electoral tie with Jefferson forced a vote in the House of Representatives, a defeat Burr believed to be orchestrated by his long-standing rival, Alexander Hamilton. Burr's simmering hatred for Hamilton led to a duel between the men on the morning of July 11, 1804, where the sitting vice president shot Hamilton to death, effectively ending both men's political careers. Before heading west to dodge an outraged public back east, in a shady scheme to resurrect his tarnished political career with a fresh start out west, in August of 1804, Burr made contact with British Ambassador Anthony Merry, suggesting that with Burr's help, Britain could wrest most lands acquired by the Louisiana Purchase from the United States in exchange for money and ships to put Burr's envisioned conquest in motion. Tried for conspiracy and high misdemeanor after the plot was exposed, Chief Justice John Marshall acquitted Burr of both charges. However, Burr's conspiracy scandal left his political career in worse ruin than before. After spending 4 years abroad attempting to garner support for a revolution in Mexico and several other Spanish colonies, Burr returned home utterly broke, growing dependent upon his friends' financial support before passing away at his cousin's Staten Island home on September 14, 1836, making the life and peculiar politics of Aaron Burr one of the oddest, complex founding fathers in American history. Marquis de Lafayette. Born into a wealthy family in 1757 France, the Marquis de Lafayette, or simply Lafayette as he was known in the colonies, lost his father during a battle in the 7 Years' War, followed by his mother and grandfather, who both died in 1770, leaving Lafayette with little family, but a vast inheritance. Inspired by stories of the colonialist struggle against British oppression, Lafayette sailed to the newly declared United States in 1777, intent on joining the uprising. Initially rebuffed by colonial leaders, he soon impressed them with his passion and willingness to serve for free. Combined with his knowledge of line-style European warfare and his imaginative suggestions for skirmish tactics to combat the British, quickly allowed him to rise to the rank of Major General in the Continental Army. His first major combat duty came during the September 1777 Battle of Brandywine, when he was shot in the leg while helping to organize a retreat. General George Washington requested doctors to take special care of the wounded Frenchman, igniting a strong bond between the two men, which lasted until Washington's death. Following a hard-scrabble winter at Valley Forge, in May of 1778, he outwitted the British, who were intent on capturing him at Bunker Hill, and rallied a shaky Continental attack at Monmouth Courthouse to force a stalemate. After traveling to France to press Louis XVI for more aid, Lafayette assumed increased military responsibility upon his return to the American war effort. As commander of the Virginia Continental Forces in 1781, he helped keep British Lieutenant General Lord Cornwallis's army pinned down at Yorktown, Virginia, while divisions led by Washington and France's Comte de Rochambeau surrounded the British in a flanking maneuver, forcing Britain's surrender in the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. Known as the Hero of Two Worlds, after returning to his home country in December 1781, Lafayette rejoined the French army and organized trade agreements with Thomas Jefferson, the American ambassador to France. With the country on the verge of major political and social upheaval, Lafayette advocated for a governing body representing the three social classes and drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen with the help of Thomas Jefferson. Named commander of the Paris National Guard as violence broke out in 1789, Lafayette was obligated to protect the royal family, a position that left him vulnerable to the many factions vying for power. He fled the country in 1792, but was captured by Austrian forces and held prisoner until 1799. After Charles X was overthrown during the July Revolution of 1830, Lafayette was presented with the opportunity to become dictator. The aging statesman demurred to let rule pass to Louis Philippe. Following a battle with pneumonia, he died on May 20th, 1834, making Lafayette an important crossover between two historic revolutions. John Quincy Adams. Born in 1767, Massachusetts, the first son of John and Abigail Adams, as a boy, John Quincy Adams witnessed the 1775 Battle of Bunker Hill from a rise near his family's farm, later achieving proficiency in 7 foreign languages while studying at several European universities. Completing his education at Harvard, Adams studied law before his admittance to the bar in 1790, setting up a law practice in Boston before his election to the Massachusetts State Senate, followed by the U.S. Senate in 1803. Growing ever more estranged from the Federalist Party, Adams resigned his Senate seat in 1808 to join the faculty at Harvard as a full professor. A year later, President James Madison appointed Adams ambassador to the Russian court of Tsar Alexander I, where he witnessed Napoleon's invasion and subsequent retreat from Russia, an event which resulted in the near destruction of Napoleon's Grand Army and the deaths of some 380,000 French soldiers. After the War of 1812 resulted in an American victory over Great Britain's attempted aggression, in 1814, Madison sent Adams to Belgium, where he negotiated the war-ending Treaty of Ghent. 3 years later, President James Monroe named Adams his Secretary of State, where he negotiated the joint occupation of Oregon with England and the acquisition of Florida from Spain, followed by his role as chief architect behind the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which warned European powers against further colonization in the Western Hemisphere. Winning the White House in 1824, after a 5-way presidential race was decided by the House of Representatives, something Andrew Jackson supporters called a corrupt bargain, Adams' one-term presidency would be largely stymied by Jacksonian Democrats in Congress And while his bid for a second term was marred by accusations of corruption and steady pushback against his unpopular domestic programs, including federal funding of an interstate road and canal system, and his staunch opposition to slavery, John Quincy Adams, like his father before him, became the second president in U.S. history who failed to win a second term. Losing to Andrew Jackson in the election of 1828, Adams spent the remainder of his life as a congressman from Massachusetts in the U.S. House of Representatives, earning the nickname Old Man Eloquent before passing away following back-to-back strokes on February 23, 1848, forever cementing John Quincy Adams into the annals of American politics. Today in the Daily Dose, Ben Franklin's Postal Service spawns an American Revolution. By the still tender age of 31, Ben Franklin had already built a prosperous business as a printer, shopkeeper, and publisher of the Pennsylvania Gazette, not to mention the author of the wildly successful Poor Richard's Almanac. In 1737, he was appointed postmaster of Philadelphia, after British authorities removed his predecessor for failing to submit financial reports. Being a local postmaster didn't come with much pay, but it did allow Franklin to mail his newspaper to readers at no cost, making the Pennsylvania Gazette one of the colony's most successful publications. Comparable to how politicians and celebrities rely on platforms such as Twitter, Franklin used the mail for self-promotion of his many achievements, making the Founding Father one of the world's most admired Americans. Due to his meticulous record-keeping, Franklin was asked by his British overlords to manage Britain's colonial mail service from 1753 to 1774, allowing Franklin to supercharge a primitive courier system connecting the 13 fragmented colonies into an efficiency-driven organization that sped deliveries between Philadelphia and New York City to a mere 24 hours. Franklin's travels along the post roads of colonial America would inspire his revolutionary vision for how a new nation could thrive independently of Britain. But not even Franklin could imagine the pivotal role his postal service would bring to the American Revolution. By the early 1770s, Franklin's fellow patriots had organized underground communication networks, the Committees of Correspondence, followed by the Constitutional Post, that allowed the Founding Fathers to talk treason behind the backs of their British rulers. In 1775, 3 months after the battles of Lexington and Concord, and well before the Declaration of Independence was even signed, the Continental Congress turned the Constitutional Post into the Post Office of the United States, whose operations became the first, and for many average Americans, the most significant function of the newly formed government. James Madison and other Founding Fathers understood how the Post could support a fledgling democracy, delivering inexpensive newspapers and political pamphlets that shed light on British tax bills designed to pay back Britain after her defense of the colonies during the French and Indian Wars. Put simply, Franklin's efficient management of the world's first social media platform allowed like-minded Americans to join forces in their common desire for independence. And there you have it. Franklin's Postal Service spawns an American Revolution. Today on the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com.